The ceiling in this Gothic castle is not made of stone. It's molded from papier-mâché, glued paper and plaster, and then painted. This is the greatest architectural deception, but it conceals a deception far more terrifying. The money for this forgery was stolen from an entire nation during the financial crash of 1720, and part of it was earned from the Otranto contract, the exclusive right to supply human cargo to the Spanish colonies. And you know what's most insane? This toy castle, built on dirty money, became the prototype for one of the most famous buildings in the world, the modern British Parliament. How could the whim of an aristocrat, trying to escape reality, come to define the look of an entire empire? The answer lies in the man who conceived this grand escape. Listen, that is the sound of footsteps on a floor polished to a mirror sheen, an echo trapped beneath gilded vaults. The air here is dense, smelling of lemon wax, old paper, and a silence that is very expensive. This is Strawberry Hill. Every corner here poses. Every room is a perfectly tuned note in a symphony of taste. Light, passing through stained glass windows, leaves precious bruises on the parquet floor. Ruby, sapphire, emerald. The walls, draped in crimson silk, boast portraits of people with eyes as cold as marble. Everything speaks of genius, of the triumph of imagination over stone, of a flawless dream frozen in time. This is a lie, or at least not the whole truth. This house's memory is not a glossy page. Its memory is a scar. To see it, you just need to turn off the lights and listen for another sound, the creak of an old film projector. There it is, the year 1950. A black and white photograph, grainy like unsifted flour. The same room, but instead of a golden vault, there is a black hole, a gaping wound through which a gray, indifferent sky stares. Instead of silk, the stripped skin of wallpaper, hanging in tatters from the exposed lath. It doesn't smell of wax here, but of damp plaster and mouse droppings. Next frame, the majestic gallery, the very one where the sun reflects today. But then a draft blew through it, shattering the last panes of glass in the windows. The ceiling, that marvel of papier-mâché, sagged like wet cloth. It no longer imitated the vaults of Henry VII's chapel. It was imitating agony. This is not a story of triumph. This is an autopsy report. The story of a house that was dying. Twice. A house whose heart was torn out, whose treasures were scattered to the winds, whose walls were left to rot in the rain. So how did this treasure box, created with enough money to fund an army, turn into a ghost? How did an architectural manifesto that changed the tastes of an entire empire become just a ruin, forgotten on the banks of the Thames? The answer is not hidden in the stone. It's in the man, in the ghost who still roams these corridors, a lonely, capricious aristocrat who built himself a theater to play a single role, the role of himself. Who was he? A genius? A madman? Or simply the loneliest man of the 18th century who erected the world's most beautiful tomb for a life that never truly began? To understand this castle, you have to rewind time, to leave its quiet rooms and plunge into the filth from which it grew. London, the 18th century, a city choking on the smell of coal, gin, and dirty water, a city where gilded carriages clatter over cobblestones, splashing filth on those who walk. This is a cruel, pragmatic world, a world ruled not by God or the king, but by calculation, as cold as a guillotine's blade. And this world had its own architect, Sir Robert Walpole, the father. He wasn't a politician. He was a butcher of politics, a man with a heavy gaze and a quiet voice who believed in one simple truth. Every man has his price. He didn't build an empire on ideals. He bought it wholesale. A soul for a post, a vote for a contract, loyalty for a bag of gold. The halls of Parliament didn't smell of laws, but of wax and power. They didn't argue here. They made deals. This castle's foundation was not laid in the earth. It was laid in human greed. Here is the first stone. The year 1720. The South Sea bubble collapse. A financial fever that promised fabulous riches from trade with the New World. The entire nation went mad. Aristocrats and maids, scholars and shopkeepers, everyone threw their savings into this fire. And then, silence. The loud pop of a bursting bubble, and the quiet crunch of breaking lives. In this chaos, Sir Robert was calm. He played on the panic like a harpsichord. He saved the country from collapse, but first, he saved his family's wallet, turning others' grief into his fortune. And here is the second stone, the darkest one. Part of the South Sea Company's wealth was tied to a single word, asiento, a contract, the exclusive right to supply human cargo to the Spanish colonies. Behind this elegant word lies the creak of salt-soaked planks, the clang of chains, and the holds of ships crammed with human despair. The money earned from this doesn't jingle, it whispers. And this entire stream, murky, bloody, heavy, flowed into the pocket of his son, Horace. Horace Walpole never worked a day in his life. He didn't have to. His father created a system for him. 3 sinecures, government posts with names that sound like incantations: Usher of the Exchequer, Comptroller of the Pipe, Clerk of the Estreats. Responsibilities, 0. Salary, enormous, £3,400 a year, a sum for which a simple craftsman would have to toil for almost his entire life. This was money siphoned from the very system itself, a percentage of the taxes paid by every cobbler and baker in England. Money laundered through a labyrinth of bureaucracy until it became respectable. And Horace took it without asking questions. He despised his father's world, a world of sweaty hands, loud arguments, and dirty deals. He considered himself above it. He was a man of taste, of art, of fantasy. In these coins, he saw neither the tears of ruined investors, nor the sweat of taxpayers, nor the blood of nameless slaves. He saw only a means to build a wall between himself and reality, a wall of stone, towers, and stained glass, a wall he would call Strawberry Hill. Every pound spent on Gothic vaults was stolen from the pragmatic world. Every spire reaching for the sky was paid for by a deal struck in a dimly lit office. A foundation of sin proved to be surprisingly strong. The father was made of granite, the son of smoke and moonlight. In Sir Robert's world, weight was valued. The weight of gold in the treasury, the weight of a word in Parliament, the weight of a fist on the table. Horace Walpole was weightless. He was not a warrior, not a politician, not a businessman. In the thundering machine of his father's empire, he was an extraneous part, elegant, but useless. His world didn't smell of port and cigar smoke, but of old books and withered roses. His weapon was not the command, but the witticism. His battlefield was not the House of Commons, but the page of a letter. He was a stranger in his own family, an actor without a stage. And so he decided to build himself a theater. Strawberry Hill is not a home. It never was. It's a stage set, a suit of armor, the physical embodiment of a soul that felt cramped by reality. Every decision made here is not architecture, it's psychology. Look at the era, the age of reason, the age of enlightenment. Everyone around was building palaces that resembled ancient Roman temples, symmetrical, logical, cold. Palladian architecture was the architecture of power, understandable, predictable, oppressive. It was his father's style, and Horace answered it with Gothic. This was his rebellion, an aesthetic mutiny. He chose a style that was despised, the style of the Dark Ages, of superstition, chaos, and mystery. He wanted to build a place where logic gives way to imagination, where straight lines bend under the weight of dreams, and where light exists only to create deeper, more interesting shadows. Every spire piercing the sky is a challenge to the pragmatic world. Every pointed arch is a mockery of the boring correctness of the classical column. And the walls, why did he need such walls? Not to protect against enemies, to protect himself from the world. A world that demanded he be someone he was not. A world that could condemn, ridicule, destroy him for a single careless thought, for a single forbidden emotion. Historians whisper about his true nature, hidden behind a fan and a witty phrase. In an era when a man's very nature could be a crime, he needed a sanctuary, a fortress. The castle became his stage, where he was the playwright, the director, and the only audience member who knew the whole truth. Long, gloomy corridors leading to dazzlingly bright halls. This is not a design flaw. This is his script. He controlled his guests' emotions, leading them through darkness to light, through anticipation to ecstasy. He was the master not just of a house, but of an entire universe. He didn't need 100 rooms. He needed 100 masks. The library, for the role of the scholar. The gallery, for the role of the patron. The Gothic bedroom, dark as a crypt, for dreams that would turn into nightmares and give birth to the world's first Gothic novel. He wasn't building a house. He was casting his own soul in stone, a soul that was fragile, complex, and frightened, and he hid it behind the crenellated walls of a toy castle. It wasn't construction. It was a fever, a 50-year obsession that gripped him and wouldn't let go until the day he died. The great construction of Strawberry Hill didn't follow blueprints. It followed whims. It wasn't a methodical process, but a chaotic, agonizing growth, like a crystal growing facets in a random yet predetermined order. The war began. The first war, with money. His fortune, which had seemed bottomless, turned into a financial well into which he threw bags of gold. The castle was an insatiable beast. It devoured his inheritance. It devoured the income from his sinecures. It devoured time itself. Every new tower, every stained glass window, every whimsical chimera demanded its tribute. Horace, who had never known the value of money, learned to complain of its scarcity. He saved on candles but spent a fortune on a replica of a medieval archbishop's tomb, only to turn it into a fireplace. The Second War, with public opinion. The Age of Reason looked upon his venture with a disdainful smirk. Paper Gothic, the critics hissed. A toy. The whim of an affected dilettante. Gothic madness. His castle was considered the height of tastelessness, an architectural joke. But the louder they laughed, the higher he built his towers. Every scathing remark became fresh mortar for its walls. And the third, most important war, with matter itself, with reality. He dreamed of ancient walls but got fresh plaster. He dreamt of age-old stone vaults, but his craftsmen could only offer him wood and papier-mâché. This is the greatest deception of Strawberry Hill. It is not a castle. It is a theatrical set on the scale of an entire house. The ceiling in the gallery, echoing the miraculous fan vaults of Westminster Abbey, was not carved from stone by generations of masons. It was molded from glued paper and plaster, then painted to look like stone so skillfully that the deception became art. The crenellated walls could not withstand a siege. They could barely hold their own weight. He transformed from an aristocrat into a foreman, from a collector into an obsessive perfectionist. He personally drew sketches for wallpaper, argued with carpenters over the shape of windows, and rummaged through dusty folios, searching for the design of an ancient altar to copy for his bookshelves. He created a committee of taste from his dilettante friends, but in the end, the final word was always his. He was the tyrant of his own dream. It was a battle for every detail. The craftsmen of the 18th century had forgotten how to work with the Gothic style. They had to reinvent techniques to bring his fantasies to life. They didn't understand him. They were building a house, but he was casting a spell. He demanded they create gloom, a mysterious, dusky light filtering through stained glass windows. They brought him samples, and he rejected them one by one. This castle was not built of stone and plaster. It was built of pure, distilled stubbornness, of a desire to prove to the whole world that his fantasy was more real than their dull reality. And then, the castle was finished. Perfect, complete, flawless. The gilded cage had snapped shut, and the master was inside. By day, Strawberry Hill lived a strange, public life. It became a curiosity, a mandatory stop on the itinerary of any enlightened traveler. Like the keeper of a bizarre beast, Horace Walpole personally issued tickets for admission, no more than 4 at a time, strictly during the summer months. No children allowed. He wrote the rules himself, turning his home into a museum in his own lifetime. He led groups through the halls, reciting the history of every object, every trinket, by rote. The guests were amazed. They gasped. They wrote their impressions in their diaries. And the host watched their faces, searching for a reflection of his own delight. In the evening, another performance began. The halls filled with the light of hundreds of candles. All of London's high society flocked here. Dukes and ambassadors, poets and artists. The air hummed with the rustle of silk, the delicate clinking of glasses, and witty gossip. Walpole was in his element, brilliant, acerbic, mannered. He flitted from guest to guest, conducting this performance. But behind his back, in the dark corners, they whispered. They admired his house, but they laughed at him. To them, it remained an eccentric toy, and its owner, an oddball who had squandered a fortune on a Gothic folly. But then, night would fall. The last carriage would depart, taking the laughter and the warmth of human bodies with it. The servants would extinguish the candles, and the castle would plunge into darkness and silence. And that silence was deafening. It was crushing. The echo of the master's footsteps in the empty galleries sounded lonely and out of place. The thousands of objects in his collection, armor, vases, paintings, ancient coins, were silent. They were beautiful and utterly lifeless. The tragedy of this success, all its bitter irony, was embodied in one small death. He had a cat, a beloved cat named Selima. One day, playing in one of the rooms, she jumped onto a pedestal where a precious Chinese vase with goldfish stood. She was captivated by their shimmer. Trying to catch the living gold, she reached out, lost her balance, and fell into the water. The smooth, slippery porcelain walls gave her no escape. She drowned, surrounded by incredible beauty, within a work of art. That death was an epitaph for the entire house. The cat, like her master, had become a prisoner and a victim of a beautiful but cold collection. She had sought life, but found only an elegant, deadly trap. Heartbroken, Walpole asked his friend, the poet Thomas Gray, to write a poem about it. Thus, the famous ode was born. But no line could drown out the truth. The house had won. It had ceased to be a sanctuary and had become a mausoleum, a museum in the name of one man. And Horace Walpole himself had transformed from its creator into its chief curator, into the lonely guardian of a radiant, perfect, ringing emptiness. An idol is not shattered by a thunderclap. It is shattered by a quiet, almost inaudible creak, the sound of time testing the strength of stone. Horace Walpole was growing old. His hands, which once held a pen and pencil with a firm grip, began to tremble. Gout, the disease of aristocrats, dug its claws into him, turning every step through his beloved castle into torture. The mirrors he had so loved became his enemies. They reflected not the brilliant master of a Gothic paradise, but a fading, fragile old man. And along with his body, his peace of mind began to crumble. The greatest enemy entered his house uninvited. Its name was the future. Walpole had built his fortress against the world, but he could not build one against time. And fear, like a fine crack in a vault, crawled across the walls of his soul. He had no children, no direct heir. There was no one who could understand his creation, who could see in this pile of stone and papier-mâché not just a house, but an encrypted message, an architectural confession. He looked at his nephews and nieces and saw in their eyes only polite bewilderment. To them, the castle was just a collection of assets. The collection, a pile of expensive junk. Paranoia became his shadow. He began to see the future, and it was ugly. He imagined strange, indifferent hands touching his treasures. He pictured an auctioneer's gavel, cold and merciless, passing sentence on every object into which he had poured his soul. How his castle, his stage, his armor would be dismantled piece by piece and sold to those who see only the price, but not the value. This fear drove him to take up his pen one last time. He began to write his will, but it was no ordinary will. It was an attempt to defy death, an attempt to rule his castle from the grave. Page by page, he created a most complex legal structure, trying to bind the future with the chains of laws and conditions. He described every object, specified its exact place, and forbade the sale or movement of anything. He tried to turn his home into an inviolable sanctuary. It was during this time, in the midst of his struggle with old age and fear, that a dream came to him, or a nightmare. One night, in his Gothic bedroom, under the vaulted ceiling, he saw it. A huge hand in ancient armor resting on the banister of the main staircase. The image was so vivid, so terrifying, that he awoke in a cold sweat. It was a vision, a premonition. The house, his creation, had begun to speak to him in the language of his own fantasies. It felt the same as its master: fragility, vulnerability, the approaching end. The gigantic hand was not just an image from chivalric romances. It was a symbol of fate, of an inexorable force that would come and destroy everything. This nightmare became a seed. From it, like a dragon's tooth, grew a novel. The Castle of Otranto. A story of a curse, of destruction, of a giant helmet falling from the sky and crushing the air. He wrote the world's first Gothic story, not realizing that he was writing a prophecy about the fate of his own castle. Death came for him quietly in 1797. His legal chains, with which he tried to bind the future, proved as fragile as his papier-mâché vaults. The castle held its breath and waited. The agony did not begin at once. It crept in over nearly half a century. But when the blow was struck, it was more terrible than any nightmare. 1842. Spring. The heirs, the Waldegrave family, to whom his passion was foreign and his debts a burden, delivered their verdict. They decided to hold a great sale. this was not merely a sale. It was a public execution. The execution of taste, of memory, and of one man's soul. 24 days of shame, stretched out over a full month. Imagine the spectacle. A crowd poured into the halls where Walpole had admitted only a select few: merchants, onlookers, the nouveau riche with their thick wallets and empty eyes. They walked through his rooms, poking their fingers at paintings, shamelessly picking up objects he had touched with reverence. The air, once scented with wax and old books, filled with the smell of greed. A catalogue was printed, a humiliating document that did not simply list the items, but mocked them. The collection of his entire life was called an assemblage of trifles. His taste, eccentric. His passion, a whim. And then the sound of the hammer began. That sound, dry and final, became the soundtrack to the destruction. Every strike was an organ torn from the body of his castle. The hammer fell. Gone was the collection of Roman coins he had spent decades assembling. The hammer fell. Gone was the armor of Francis I that greeted guests in the hall. The hammer fell. Gone was the very Chinese vase in which his cat had drowned, becoming simply lot number 12. 4,000 items, 4,000 shards of his soul, every engraving, every enamel portrait, every book with his notes in the margins, all of it passed into foreign, indifferent hands. It was an act of vandalism, cloaked in the respectable form of an auction. When it was all over, the castle fell silent. The camera slowly drifts through the empty rooms. There is no more furniture, no paintings, no life. On the faded silk wallpaper, only dark, ghostly outlines remained. Rectangles and ovals where the portraits had hung, lighter patches on the floor where cabinets had stood. The house was blinded. Its heart had been torn out and sold off, piece by piece. It was the triumph of the pragmatic world he so despised, a world that proved to him that everything, even a dream, has its price, and that this price can be paid by anyone. Horace Walpole's worst fears had come true. His castle had been turned into an empty, plundered shell, a tomb from which even the mummy had been stolen. So what was left? Ashes, dust, empty halls, and the memory of shame. A papier-mâché ghost, doomed to oblivion. But here, the story takes its most ironic, most cruel twist. The verdict of time was not what the heirs had expected. Walpole lost the battle for his stone, but he won the war of ideas. The idea proved to be stronger. His Gothic madness, once ridiculed, broke free from his garden and infected all of England. The Gothic Revival, which he had birthed almost by accident, out of whim and stubbornness, became the architectural language of an entire era. Its echo, amplified and raised to an absolute, was frozen in the stone of the empire's very heart, in the lace-like spires and majestic vaults of the Palace of Westminster. The British Houses of Parliament, his illegitimate but powerful descendant, a lonely eccentric, building a toy castle with sinful money, had unwittingly given the nation its new imperial style. But the greatest miracle was even quieter, even more subtle. Walpole had lost the battle for his collection. 4,000 items were scattered across the world, and to reassemble them was impossible. His castle was emptied. But among all the treasures, there was one, the most fragile, the most ephemeral, the Word. Before his death, obsessed with the fear of being forgotten, he had composed a detailed description of his house, a description of the villa of Mr. Horace Walpole. Page by page, he catalogued not just the objects, but the very atmosphere. He described how the light fell in the library, how the parquet floor creaked in the gallery, where every painting hung, where every statuette stood. This text, this paper ghost of the castle, outlived everything. It outlived the auction. It outlived the desolation. It outlived 2 centuries of decay and indifference. And when, in the 21st century, restorers entered these ruins, they held the key in their hands. Their main tools were not hammers and trowels, but his words. They restored the lost murals, checking against his descriptions. They searched the world and returned items to their places, guided by his inventories. They recreated the stained glass windows by reading about the gloomy and mysterious light he had wanted to see there. The word proved stronger than stone, ink more durable than gold leaf. The Strawberry Hill we see today is a miracle of resurrection, but it was not resurrected by money. It was resurrected by one man's obsession, recorded on paper. So what is immortal? The strong walls that turn to dust, or a fragile fantasy accidentally dropped into the world? Horace Walpole desperately tried to build an eternal material fortress. He failed, but his eccentric dream, born in solitude and fed by sinful money, unintentionally changed the world. His real castle, his imperishable legacy, turned out to be built not of stone and plaster. It was built from letters. So what, in the end, proves to be stronger? Stone, meant to stand for centuries, but crumbled to dust under the auctioneer's hammer? Or the word, as fragile as a butterfly's wing, that outlived its creators, its destroyers, and by the power of obsession alone, raised entire walls from oblivion? The story of Strawberry Hill is a parable that the strongest fortresses are built not of stone, but of ink. And if that is so, then what do we see today, wandering through these impeccable halls? The restored dream of one man, or just a beautiful but empty shell, whose true, trembling soul remains forever on the pages of his books? Where, in your opinion, does a true legacy reside? In stone or in the word? Share your thoughts in the comments. It would be the best thanks for our work. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new stories.